Hi, welcome to the Canadian City and Southern Model Railroad. Today's video is about having to shorten rails again because the layout is shrinking as the wood dries out over the winter. Well, it's happening again. The railroad is continuing to shrink a tiny little bit with the cool weather and the layout drying out due to the heat running so much. It's also preventing the switches from moving all the way. I've also had to cut a big hole in my scenery. This hole here is supposed to be there. That's where the mine goes, but I wanted to move it out of the way before I started to saw into it. This in here isn't as bad out of gauge. But it's been forced over enough to make a kink here where the flex track in the tunnel matches up to the hand laid track. So I had to cut the top off the hill. The same thing happened back in here. It's not as drastic. It's still in gauge, but there is a little bit of a bow that's been forced into the flex track. So I'm going to need to shorten rails and reattach rail joiners. And that's going to be tricky because underneath each rail joiner, I have to smooth out the rail so that the rail joiner fits tight. Back in here, I've already fixed this once. And there is clearance between the end of the rails and the rest of the switch on the stub switch, but it's still a bit tight and was enough to snap off the end of the throw rod when the switch was being thrown the other day. So I made my hole big enough to get to that as well. Well, all the rails have been shortened and everything's been repaired and everything is now back in gauge. But on this switch here, I was still having some trouble. And it wasn't gauge, it was because the ties weren't really flat and the points were sticking up in the air and stuff was derailing as it rolled off the end of the points. So I've removed a bit more scenery here in order to be able to get in to work on it. I've sanded down those ties and now I'll restain them and then that switch can go back in. Well, everything up in here and down in here is all back in gauge. But this switch, the points were high even though it was in gauge. So I had to sand down the ties. And I still ended up having to make 3 or 4 different throw rods and getting the exact position right so that it would throw all the way without raising the points as the throw rod wants to ride up and down on the wire that controls it. So now maybe I'll have to go in and ballast this while it's easy to reach. Also, when I put the hills back, I think I'll make them a little taller. The tracks have all been repaired. The rails that needed to be shortened have been shortened. This switch had to be redone several times to get it to throw evenly. This section has not been glued back in. It's just sitting here. That made it easier to get in with my tools to fix this area in here with the tools coming in more flat. This little bit has been glued back in. This piece has been glued back in. And these pieces back here have been glued back in. The seams left from the saw will be filled in with plaster in a little bit. This piece is still going to be left removable. I'll fill the seams with plaster and I'm going to have to recarve it. But I want to be able to remove it to help me when I get ready to put the tunnel portholes. This will be a wooden porthole. This will be a stone portal to designate the fact that it's two different railroads. I also added a piece of foam here and a couple pieces up here to extend the height a little bit. I thought at first I wouldn't like it, but I actually like these little outcroppings at the top, so I decided to enhance them. The scenery's all back in place. And I blended it together with a little bit of warm gray and raw sienna joint compound. And the areas where the track has been re-gauged and the rails have been shortened to compensate for the shrinkage of the layout and the drying out of the wood over the winter has been ballasted. An eastbound work train with Mike at the throttle and Jake firing. Heads back to the north. Well, thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share, and we'll see you next time.